Welcome to the UN Brief. In early December, UNDP Geneva delivered an event focusing on how citizens organize for climate action and how stronger financial commitments by governments can be submitted next year in Brazil during COP30, the UN Climate Change Conference. I interviewed Dana Fisher, who is director of the Center for Environment, Community and Equity and a professor at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching and listening to the UN Brief, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for taking a moment to speak with the UN Brief. I was really very intrigued by your conversation, your presentation yesterday at the UN event. So tell us a little bit, how did you come about to writing this book, Saving Ourselves?
So Saving Ourselves is actually a combination of research that I've done for the past 25 years. So I started out, my first book I ever wrote was called National Governance in the Global Climate Change Regime, which was about the Kyoto Protocol, and it was based on my dissertation research. Actually, you can see here on my bookshelf I have, that was the cover that a friend of mine did, which is it's a bunch of cards with different flags, as you can see, all about, and you can see actually the Just Cans Alliance there very clearly, because basically the House of Cards fell down around the Kyoto Protocol. We haven't really rebuilt that house of cards, although the Paris Agreement was supposed to be more of a house of like Legos. I don't know, I'm trying to think of something sturdier, but still not necessarily up to the task. So anyway, I've been studying climate policy making for my entire career. And I've come at it from both a policy perspective, looking at the international politics, and I do a lot of work on elite politics in the United States, but also simultaneously I study civil society participation, and I've written a number of books around activism and the role that citizens play in both international regimes, but then also in policymaking at the local level and within nation states. And so as I have been moving forward, it became really clear to me that we weren't getting where we needed to go, and that we were now moving up. And when I was working on the book, we were moving towards the 28th Conference of the Parties. And I remember thinking about the excitement we had around COP6, right, which was 2000. That was when the Kyoto Protocol was going to be finalized and moved to enter into legal force. And so I just thought, you know what, it's time for me to bring all of the data that I've collected together, including this work that I had done for the IPCC, thinking about the effects of civil society engagement and activism, to think through how we actually are going to get where we need to go in terms of addressing the climate crisis. And that's how Saving Ourselves came about. I mean, the other thing that's unique about this book for me is that it's actually a book written for the general public. So it's not a book written for graduate students and for an academic audience. I wanted this to be something that everybody who cares about climate change could read and would want to read and would feel comfortable reading. And I hope that I accomplished that goal, but that was the goal.
Yes, and I thought it was interesting too, because your research involves also looking at activist groups, right? And what you think first when you think about activism in climate change, you think of the Fridays for Future and other youth-led movements. However, there are other movements too happening. Tell us a little bit of what you see is the scope of movements, because I know Jane Fonda, the actress and activist, also created an event where she was, also trying to get more people around understanding what's at stake with climate action.
Right. I mean, actually, Jane Fonda is a great example. And in fact, she's here today in Washington, D.C. doing a climate event. One of the things that is really interesting, I've been studying climate activism, again, also since those early days in the late 90s. And I actually started out, I've done a lot of work on civil society and activism, but it started with the climate movement. And I always come back to the climate movement. So the book before Saving Ourselves was called American Resistance, and it was about the coalition of left-leaning groups that were pushing against the Trump administration and its policies. And so the climate movement was in there, but it was one component of this broader coalition. But when I look at the climate movement, what's very interesting is that the climate movement used to be very internationally focused, because the idea was that there was this notion that if the international regime came out with strong policies, those would trickle down to the nation state level, particularly in the developing or the developed worlds, the Annex I countries. And so while there were climate movements doing work in nation states, a lot of the kind of big actions we saw took place at these international meetings. That's not the case anymore. And I think Fridays for Future played a big role in this transition to more organic and locally embedded and nationally embedded movements that were not just around, trying to get the UN and the UN process to work, but rather to get states to change. And so young people certainly played a big role in it, although they were really not very, they weren't the leaders of the movement prior to Fridays for Future, prior to, Greta and a number of other youth-led, youth activists who really helped to lead and galvanize this youth-led movement that fizzled out, unfortunately, during the pandemic, because people ended up going into lockdown, and it really affected the movement's momentum. At the same time that we saw Fridays for Future coming about, Jane Fonda actually started this program that she called Fire Drill Fridays, which was in collaboration with a number of folks, including Greenpeace. And it actually took place here in Washington, D.C. I'm just pointing here because I'm in Washington, D.C. And initially, it's funny because I actually, I thought it was I was really disappointed in her decision to start to do these Fire Drill Fridays, because she was doing it on the grounds of the Capitol, and she was doing it simultaneous to when the youth climate strikes were happening in DC. And so in some ways, I originally thought that she was kind of stealing the young people's thunder, and that she was going to jump on top of the momentum that they were building. But what was really fascinating about what she did is she actually tried to bring in experts, and she basically lifted up experts and their expertise. In some cases, they were young people, but in many cases, they were older, non-youth climate groups, climate representatives, climate-focused individuals, and she gave them a platform. And what she also did at the same time is she also leaned into her experience with nonviolent civil disobedience and took advantage of what nonviolent civil disobedience does in terms of attracting attention, particularly when well-known, or what we like to call the notables, get arrested, it gets attention. And so she took advantage of that media attention to turn out more people. And instead of just speaking, which is what I had originally thought she was going to do, she basically brought in people talking about all of these very specific components of the climate crisis that need to be addressed for us to actually address the problems in a systemic way. And she helped lift them up. And I thought that was wonderful. So she won me over, so I'm a big fan. And one of the things that I do in my research is I actually, I survey people when they turn out at protests. We haven't seen a lot of big climate focused protests in the past few years, particularly here in the United States. But we did have the March to End Fossil Fuels, which was about 75,000 people in the streets of New York City before the UN General Assembly, not this year, but the year before in 2023. So I did a survey, for example, there. And one of the things that I found that I thought was really quite interesting was that the age distribution of the people on the streets was what we call bimodal, which meant that we had a lot of young people, just as you would expect, because the youth climate movement has gotten a lot of attention. But we also had a lot of older people. And there are a number of organizations, probably the most well-known of them in the United States is Third Act, but we also have Extinction Rebellion, which is quite popular here in the United States as well. And those groups tend to bring out people who are, older, not old, but older. And we know from research that people tend to get involved in activism and engage in their civic lives more when they have children out of the house, right? So like I have 2 kids at home right now, so I have to get home at the end of the day to make sure that they eat, or at least they eat healthy, right? And that they don't spend the whole evening on their phones, which is what they will do if I do not come home. And the thing is that once they're done, I have a lot more time to get out in the streets. And so what we basically are seeing right now is that the young people and then the older people are very active, but we're missing that middle. And the middle is part of, when they mobilize, it's part of what we would see as more of a mass mobilization, which we're not seeing right now around climate change. But that's what the book talks about is coming.
Right, yes. It is important to know that we get everyone on board, really. And it is wonderful because we noticed too, I think through other researching by other universities and political scientists, that older people tend to become more engaged also, and they go and vote more because once they turn 60, they realize, how much the state can interfere or can actually support their ideas of what the society should look like. So they
Sure. I mean, I would just say that we've actually, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just to say that we've actually seen older adults taking a real lead in climate litigation. There's a very famous case from what we call the climate grannies out of Switzerland.
Right. They were
For
speaking yesterday here at the UN. She was,
right.
oh, yes.
Yeah, I know. I saw that one of them came out for the event. So, but I mean, so we do see this happening all over the world. It's not just a phenomenon in one particular country. It's a very common phenomenon. And like you were saying, people we know as they get older, they start to feel more responsible for making sure that they're passing on to children and to the next generation a country, a world that they're more comfortable with.
Yeah, indeed. And to wrap it up, tell us a little bit about the question of anxiety, climate anxiety, which is so prevalent. Lots of youth have been reporting that, right? That they are worried because they don't have a future, maybe. And of course, other people too, the elderly too. You can see every summer the elderly suffer more and more because they don't have the means to sometimes have an air conditioning. In some countries, it's not very common. They say air conditioning can also make the climate worse. So there is a lot of anxiety in general, right, around what can we do, right, from our everyday actions. What did you discover through your research?
Well, one of the things my research found is that, first of all, you're absolutely right. There are many people, young people and older people, who are feeling climate anxiety. And they're feeling climate anxiety because at this point, we see the climate changing around us. When I started out in the late 1990s doing this work, we spoke about the idea that the climate would change and the idea that we needed to protect the polar bears. But we're no longer worried about the polar bears. We're worried about people in our own communities, the elderly, those at risk, those who have to work outside, who are most exposed to climate shocks when climate shocks hit. And we know from the science they will. Because of that, people feel a lot more anxiety. One of the things I found in my research, and we actually started asking about people's emotions for those who are engaging in climate activism to see if there were interesting patterns and if we could understand the patterns. And actually, anxiety was much lower than I expected. Instead, what we saw was sadness and climate, what we call climate grief. And most importantly, we saw a lot of anger. And there, what's interesting for me as a social scientist who studies activism is there's a lot of research that talks about the relationship between anger and engagement and people doing something about a problem to try to push for social change. Anger is a wonderful motivation. And it also gives us a sense of what we call efficacy, right? That we can actually do something about it. So instead of feeling anxious, I suggest that people start to think about why they should be mad and why they should start to think about what they can do. Because what we've found is that anger actually helps get people out and it gets people engaged and it helps to push for the type of collective action that we need right now. So, I mean, I'm not saying people shouldn't feel anxious or, upset because there's a lot of reason to feel that way. And, some days I wake up and I feel that way too. And I worry about the world that my children are going to inherit from me and my generation. But then I also look around and there are lots of reasons for me to be angry and for me to realize that there are things that I can do to make a difference. And that's what the book is about, trying to channel that anger and outrage into action that will work.
Indeed, indeed. And tell us, just to really wrap it up this time, what are you planning for COP29 in Brazil?
You mean COP30?
Oh, COP30.
Well, so COP30 in Brazil. So I personally have sworn off attending COPs because I feel that they're a waste of carbon. I actually was contacted by one of the organizers who's going to try really hard. They say they're trying really hard to open up the COP and to bring in civil society in a much more meaningful way. And some of my early research actually found that the early days of the climate regime were much more transparent and democratic than the regime around trade. So we were looking and comparing to the World Trade Organization and other international financial institutions. And one thing that's been very sad to watch is how the climate regime has become less open, permeable, transparent, and democratic. And these folks who are organizing in Brazil say that they're going to try to do a lot more to give civil society a voice and a space in the COP. If that's the case, I may very well be open to participating if I feel like there's something that I can do that can help. I do not want to waste my carbon. I try very hard to be careful. And I don't want to go, I mean, as I've said to people historically, you know, it became this thing where you go to a COP and you fly to another part of the world to sit at a panel with two people who work in the same city as you, and you present research that you all know about already. And I don't want to be that person. But if there's a reason that my science and my perspective can be helpful, I'm open to it. But it would have to be compelling. And I want to make sure that I'm contributing and helping to provide legitimacy to a COP that is transparent, democratic, and gives the people a voice, which is what this whole regime is supposed to be about.
Indeed. And thank you so much, Dana Fisher. Pleasure speaking with you. And hopefully we'll see you at COP30.
Thank you so much. It was great to chat with you as well.
Pleasure. Bye. Thank you for watching and listening to the UN Brief. And don't forget to subscribe.